Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. A very good morning to you, and you're welcome to today's Signpost webinar. I hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Mark Gibson, and I am head of the Teagasc Outreach and Innovation Program, and we're joined by Pat Murphy, who is head of the Teagasc Environment Knowledge Transfer Program, who's going to help us with questions afterwards. But before we introduce our guests, to remind you that this series is brought to you by Teagasc in collaboration with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, the National Rural Network, and Food Drink Ireland SkillNet. So slurry application is a key component of effective nutrient management planning across farms in Ireland. And however, it requires careful management to ensure it is applied in the right place and at the right time so as to avoid losses to the environment. So today we'll be discussing how we can best manage the risk of phosphorus loss from slurry application in a Northern Ireland context. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Donnacha Doody, who is leader of the Catchment Science Programme in the Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute of Northern Ireland, also known as AFBI, and Dr. Russell Adams, who is Catchment Modeller and Senior Scientific Officer with AFBI. Good morning, gentlemen. You're very welcome to the Signpost webinar.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Morning, Mark.
Great. And you're joining us from Belfast this morning, is that right?
That's correct, Belfast.
Great, great. So, Donnacha, you're not a stranger to the work we do in Teagasc, nor are you, Russell. You've both been keeping close tabs on what we're doing here in the south. Maybe, Donnacha, if I could start with you and tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing with AFBI.
Yeah, so I suppose my connection with Teagasc goes a long way back, Mark, and I did my PhD in Johnstown Castle back in 2004. And I also worked with Teagasc on the Loch Melvin project. So would have worked with Owen Carton and Hubert Tunney and those people back in those days. So I have a long kind of track record with Teagasc. I suppose I joined AFBI in 2007, and I've kind of been working there since then. Currently, I'm as you've said, I head up the Catchment Research Program, and that kind of is responsible for all of the evidence based around the nitrates action program or nutrients action program, phosphorus and nitrogen, and also we do work around pesticides and carbon and so forth. Currently, I'm also the head of the agri-environment branch on an acting basis at this stage, and that branch covers air quality, water quality, soil quality, and also agri-technology are the things that we cover. I suppose my own expertise has always been core expertise around phosphorus, but I've also do a good bit of work around kind of socioeconomic things related to the environment, and also pesticides and carbon is something that we're also looking at heavily. That's kind of broadly where I am at the moment.
Okay, so you've got a wide brief by the sounds of things there.
Moment, yeah.
And Russell, your focus is the modelling side, how we can try and, I suppose, forecast some of the behaviours at a landscape level. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that's a reasonable description, Mark. I mean, my connection with Teagasc also goes back to a few years now working with Eric Melander and his group in particular in looking at the ACP CAP program, and the primary aim here is to look at catchment modelling of these areas and to see how we can better predict nutrient losses and improve our understanding of how these catchments function. So I've had some strong links with groups in Ireland looking at catchment modelling in particular. So I'm looking forward to continuing those links into the future.
Great, great. Well, we're looking forward to you. So you're going to give us a shared presentation this morning. I think, Donnacha, you're going to kick things off. So if you could share your screen with us.
Yeah.
So I'll hand over to you, Donnacha.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. And listen, thanks again for the invite to present here today. It's always it's great to be able to get our present our work out over such a wide audience. First, I just want to start out by kind of acknowledging the co-authors on this piece of work, or the team involved in this piece of work. Russell has already introduced himself there. Anya Anderson is also heavily involved, a PhD student from Queen's. We've also been working with Pete Fadez from the USDA ARS in America, who was the person who created the model that we will talk about today. And also then Owen Fenton and Pat Toohey, in terms of they provided data and also in helping with the interpretation of some of the results. So it's been a team effort in development of some of this work. So today I want to talk about, you've already highlighted that we're talking about the risk of phosphorus loss from slurry applications. And this is a project that was funded through the DERA, the Department of Agriculture Evidence and Innovation Project, Evidence and Innovation Funding Stream. And it was a project to look at the effectiveness of the nitrates action program in terms of slurry regulations, and also specifically around the close period. And I suppose slurry isn't slurry and PLOS to water isn't just an issue for Northern Ireland. It's a widespread issue across the island, across the UK, and across Europe, and it's something that we're constantly trying to improve our management around that slurry. And in Northern Ireland, we have made improvements. If you look at the top graph here labeled A, this is our national farm gate P balance, which we produce every year. And if you look back at the early 1990s, we had a farm surplus nationally of 20 kilograms of P per hectare, which was very, very high. So there was 20 kilograms of P more going into the system than was required. But we've made significant improvements over time, due to the great actions of farmers, improvements in science, improvement in advisory services, and also an increase in the fertilizer prices. We have reduced the P surplus, and the P surpluses in 2008 came right down to 8 kilograms of P per hectare. But unfortunately, from that point, we've seen this constant rise again in our P surplus, right up to 12 kilograms of P per hectare. Now, this graph stops at 2018, but we're roughly still around there. We're at about 12 or 13 kilograms of P per hectare, and this increase has been largely driven by an increase in feed concentrate to cattle, and a reduction in the utilization of grass, and an increase in feed concentrate into the system. And that has had, the changes in water quality have mirrored those changes in the farm gate P balance. This graph the graph B here is slightly truncated, but it does show that there's been an increase in an improvement in our water quality over the years, and we've seen a constant improvement in water quality since 1990 in terms of the P concentration. And just to explain for those who may not be aware what SRP is, SRP is a soluble reactive phosphorus in the water, so it's just one form of phosphorus. And we've seen a reduction in our SRP right up to about 2008, 2009, but then we started seeing an increase again in our SRP concentrations. And they continue to increase. So that's a concern for us. In 2017, we estimate that 940 tons of phosphorus was lost from agriculture into water. Just to put that into perspective, we estimate in total input from all sectors is about 1,500 tons into water. So a significant proportion is coming from agriculture. And as a result, a significant proportion of our water bodies are impacted on by water quality. Impacted on by phosphorus, and are below the status required for the Water Framework Directive. And just to clarify here, despite Brexit, we are still adhering to the Water Framework Directive and continue to release the reports. In fact, the latest round of assessments is coming out in early December. This data I'm presenting here is actually dated it's 2018, but the next round isn't quite available yet. But so it'll be interesting to see, do we see an improvement in terms of the status of our water bodies in Northern Ireland. So just to start off, this particular graph, I don't expect you to see all the detail on this, but this is a graph of the substance flow analysis of phosphorus in the whole of the Northern Ireland food system. Very often we talk about phosphorus just within agriculture, but there's phosphorus throughout the whole food system. And what we try to do with this through a project called Refocus, which is a collaboration with Lancaster and Leeds University and others. And we try to map the stocks and flows of phosphorus throughout the whole of the Northern Irish food system. And this particular graph just shows you the complexity of the system that we're working with. There's four main systems here. You have the animal husbandry side, the livestock side, and the soil and crop side on the right hand side, and then you have the waste management and the water management, water treatment side. And what this does is shows how phosphorus is moving from each of those sectors. And it's a very useful tool, that actually, because what it's allowed us to do is look at different scenarios for sustainable phosphorus management in Northern Ireland. And that's something I'll come back to at the end of the presentation, when we look at one particular scenario we looked at in achieving targets of the Water Framework Directive. But if we zoom in here into the agricultural system, so this is the top half of the graph, you can see again, you can see kind of increased focus there on the agricultural system, and some key figures are coming out there. If you look on the left-hand side of that, you see that the inputs coming in, we have 11,700 tons of phosphorus coming in animal feed, and we have about 4,500 tons coming in fertilizer. And that the majority of that is going into all of that's going into the agricultural system, and from that we're having about 20,500 tons of phosphorus moving from animals to the crop and the soil. Now that's either deposited by the animal themselves, or it's applied as slurry. And of that 20,000 tons, 15,000 is going back back into the animal via silage, grass, and so forth. The key figure here I want to get to is this figure here in the crop and the grass, the grass component here on in this point here, is that if you look at this figure here, there's 7,300 tons of phosphorus accumulating in our soils in 2017. And 2017 was a normal enough year, so we can presume that it's roughly that amount is accumulating in our soils every year. And that's not just coming from agriculture, from slurry, it's coming from fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, but also biosolids as well. But the majority is coming from the manures that are in the system. There's more information on that, there's a paper there referenced at the top, and there's also more information on the Refocus website there. So what does that look like when you kind of spatially distribute it across Northern Ireland? Well, this is work where we just looked at the P load based on kilograms per hectare per year at a townland level, and the red and the orange areas are the ones that have real excesses of phosphorus in those townlands, and that translates into a high percentage of our soils being above the agronomic optimum. Now, just to clarify here, we use Olsen soil P to measure our soil, while down south here using Morgan's P. So it's a little bit different in terms of the index system that we use. So when we are looking for an agronomic optimum, we're looking at index 2+ or index 2-, depending on what farming system you're in. But anything here from index 3, 4, and 5 is above what's required for agriculture. And you can see from that map of Northern Ireland, and this map was produced through a pretty large soil sampling scheme called the EAA soil sampling scheme that was carried out in 2017, 2018, and it demonstrated about 42% of our soils are above the agronomic optimum. And in some sectors it's higher than that, so it's a significant issue for us going forward. Just to stop for one moment and highlight, this EAA scheme was a kind of a pilot study, and there was a lot of kind of science done around this as well to kind of show the effectiveness of providing farmers with soil sampling and mapped kind of soil maps related to soil nutrient status and also runoff risk. And this has led now on to the government announcing there last month that they will be investing £35 million into soil sampling to provide farmers with runoff risk maps, soil P maps, and so forth. So all 600,000 farmers will be available to all 600,000 farmers. And AFBI are kind of the lead organization in that in terms of delivering the soil sampling scheme and providing the maps to farmers in relation to runoff risk and so forth. So kind of watch this space, because I think there's a lot more information that will come out in terms of soil P and how it's managed in Northern Ireland in the next few years. So what does that mean in terms of achieving the targets of the Water Framework Directive? What does the excessive the 42%, the high percentage of soils above the agronomic optimum, what does that mean for achieving targets of the Water Framework Directive? Now, this is a pretty complex graph, so just to spend a few moments on it. Here on the x-axis, what you're looking at is the percentage of the catchment that is above the agronomic optimum, so that's above index 2. And you can see some of our soils up here are 40, 50, 60% are above the agronomic optimum. And some of the soils down here are, you only have 10, 15% of the soils that are above the agronomic optimum. And on the the y-axis, you've got the SRP concentration. Again, that's the phosphorus concentration in the water. And you can see there's a very strong relationship here between the percentage of your catchment that is above the agronomic optimum and the concentration of phosphorus in your river. Now, I'm just looking at one particular catchment here. This is the upper band catchment. We do a lot of our research around the nitrates action program in the upper band catchment. That's led by my colleague, Rachel Cassidy. And in the upper band, 41% of our soils are above the agronomic optimum. And to achieve the targets of Water Framework Directive, we need to be hitting 40 micrograms per litre. Now, just to explain, maybe I should explain this earlier. In Northern Ireland, we adhere to the UK method of setting standards for phosphorus, which is that your phosphorus targets are variable and they're based on alkalinity and altitude. So our targets can range from 40 micrograms per litre right up to 80, 90 micrograms per litre, which is different than what you have in Ireland, where you have a standard threshold of 35 micrograms per litre. So in the upper band, we're aiming for a target of 40 micrograms per litre. To achieve that, this graph would say we need to get to only 15% of our soils need to be above the agronomic optimum if we are to achieve that target. So, that kind of puts into context. We're currently at 41%, and we want to get down to less than 15% of our soils. And, there's a lot of research done around that issue around legacy P and that drawdown of the legacy P, and work that we've done in AFBI would suggest just on a grazing system, where the only phosphorus going into the system is from the grazing animal, it would take possibly 10 to 15 years for that phosphorus to be drawn down to a level that is at index 2. So now, obviously, it depends on soil type and depends on the starting index, but it is quite a long period of time to draw those soils down to a level that's sustainable in terms of being at index 2. So that's a big challenge when when you're applying slurry to these soils. It's a big challenge. Where do you put that slurry if you can't apply it to these soils? So just moving on to the nitrates action program, or the nutrient action program, because our nutrient action program covers both phosphorus and nitrogen. And it's very similar to your own in Ireland. We have slight changes in the regulations. For example, our close period is it's the same across the whole of the province, and it goes from 15th of October to 31st of January. And there's no applications of slurry on waterlogged soils or frozen soils. Now, just to say about waterlogged soils, that's a difficult one, because really at the moment what's being suggested is that you use the squishy boot test. If you put pressure on the soil and water ponds to the surface, then it's not suitable for slurry application. Heavy rainfall is predicted at 4 millimeters per hour within 48 hours of an application. And steep slopes are greater than 20%. There's obviously your setback distances, and we have a limit on application rates of 50 cubic meters per hectare. So that's the kind of the regulations, but we all know the farmers have a lot more considerations to take into account if they're going out to spread slurry. They need to think about the storage capacity they have left, and what is going to be the next opportunity to spread slurry, and how can they get maximum nutrient efficiency out of it. And there's also animal welfare issues and trafficability issues around soil. If you go out at the wrong time, you cause compaction and cause damage to your soil. And also a big issue for many farms in Northern Ireland, and I'm sure it's the same in Ireland, is that the contractor availability. A lot of our smaller farmers are using contractors, so there's a waiting time to get those contractors. And also then how do you time all these activities around other farm activities? So it's quite a logistically challenging process. But on top of that, in Northern Ireland, not only is it a logistically challenging process, but it's also quite inherently risky when you look at the the soil and rainfall characteristics that farmers are working on. So this particular graph here is shows the runoff risk of all of the soils in Northern Ireland. And this is based on the UK hydrology of soil types classification. And it shows that 58% of our soils are high risk for runoff. And that's all those red areas there. And then a further 31% of our soils, which are the yellow areas, are medium risk for runoff. So you can appreciate the challenges there are for farmers in identifying spatially where slurry can be spread in that sort of environment. As well as that spatial risk, There's also temporal risk. Now, I just want to spend a few moments to explain this graph here because it's kind of important for the remainder of the presentation. This graph shows soil moisture deficit, and soil moisture deficit is an indicator of soil moisture content of the soil. If you're at 0 millimeters soil moisture deficit, you're at field capacity. But if you go to minus 10 millimeters soil moisture deficit, your soil is fully saturated. So 0 to 10, your soil is getting 0 to minus 10, your soil is getting wetter and wetter. Anything above 0, plus 1, plus 2, up plus 20, your soil is getting drier and drier. Now, ideally, what you want is for slurry spreading, you want it at around 0 to 5 millimeters soil moisture deficit at its, that would be the optimum threshold. Now, ideally for trafficability, you'd want it around 5 millimeters soil moisture deficit to avoid compaction and ensure you're not damaging the soil. But at the moment, farmers can legitimately in Northern Ireland apply slurry between 0 and minus 10 soil moisture deficit. So what does it mean in terms of the risk for slurry spreading? So if we're looking at a threshold, if we're saying that the threshold is 0 millimeters soil moisture deficit, what this graph is showing is a 10-year data set, a 10-year data set of every month of the year, and it's showing the percentage number of days where the conditions of the soil was suitable for slurry spreading. Now, this is one particular site in Northern Ireland. It's our own research farm. However, the soil type here will be pretty representative of a large part of Northern Ireland. So what it's saying to us is that if you look here at January, you can see in January only 3% of days is slurry spreading conditions or conditions suitable for slurry spreading, and you can see the same here in December, and November is quite low, and also in February. However, in June and July, you have 93% of your days are above 0 millimeters soil moisture deficit, therefore are suitable for slurry spreading. For me, the interesting thing on this graph is this variability. You can see this, that's the maximum. So this is a 10-year data set. So this is the maximum value, this is the minimum value. So sometimes at least in 1 year, in July, we had only 10% or slightly more than 10% of our soils at a site was suitable for slurry spreading. While in November, sometime we had up to, on this site, we had 90% of the days in November was suitable for slurry spreading. So there's huge variability in the soil moisture deficit at this site. And that kind of highlights the challenge there is for farmers in predicting on any particular year what is the soil suitable for slurry spreading or not when they go out to spread slurry. Okay, so it's very difficult. It's a very challenging process to demonstrate the effectiveness of some of these regulations around, around the nutrient action program, but in particular around slurry spreading. How you demonstrate that, the large investment that the industry has made in slurry storage, the efforts the farmers are going to in terms of applying slurry at the right time, right place. How effective or what impact is that is having. So what we've done is we have used a model called Surface, and using that model, we've tried to look at that question around, is the nitrates action program regulations having an impact in terms of reducing losses of slurry. Now, Russell is the person who's been running this model, so I'm going to hand over to Russell just to give it a bit of an explanation, because it does, understanding what the model is saying is very important in terms of how you interpret some of the graphs we're going to show you in a few moments. Okay, Russell, over to you.
Thanks, Donnacha. This first slide explains, using a series of boxes, how the model works in terms of the flow of information. And the model itself is a black box model that simulates phosphorus losses in overland flow. And it was developed in the USDA AOS in America by Pete Teagasc, who's a collaborator on this project. And I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that Owen Fenton and Pat Tui from Teagasc have been working with me on a paper which is under review for the Hydrological Sciences Journal. So hopefully that will be coming out soon. So the model takes the input data, which Donnacha has already described, which would be rainfall, runoff, and temperature from various sites in Ireland. And then it takes some information, data files on timings, phosphorus content, and the applications of soil themselves and how they are applied to the soil. And then it goes ahead and simulates the export of SRP, another species of phosphorus, which I'll not go into. So then on the next slide, please, Donnacha. Coming back again, so working through the sequence of information here using a flowchart diagram. So me being a former computer science O-level student, I like my flowcharts. So coming on the top left here, we have the climate data, which is fed into the model. So that's 4 years of rainfall and runoff data from a plot. For example, the AFBI experimental farm site. We have soil moisture data on the top right, which Donnacha has already discussed, with the 0 millimeters being the important threshold value. So the model is then set up in such a way that it simulates applications of slurry on each day of the year, starting on the 1st of May. So these are 365 separate simulations for each scenario. So the flowchart is such that the model will have to evaluate under those scenario rules if the soil moisture deficit and the antecedent rainfall allow slurry to be spread on that day. And if it is spread, then the slurry will be applied in the model, and then the model will simulate 4 years of applications on that day. And then it will calculate the mean SRP loss in overland flow for that particular scenario for each day. If the conditions do not allow slurry to be spread on those days under that scenario, then there will be no application of slurry made on that day at all. So therefore, there'll be no model run. But obviously the scenarios vary. So in the next slide, we'll look at the two main scenarios that we'll be discussing in more detail. Next slide, please. So the key findings of the two scenarios that we're looking at is that under no restrictions, which is basically slurry is allowed to be spread on each day of the year. This is the black line, and this shows on a particular day. So if you take the 1st of May, which is on the far left side of the graph, you'll be getting on average an export of 0.06 kilograms per hectare of phosphorus a year exported from our field. If we apply the restrictions such as the NAP restrictions, which reduce the loading because spreading is restricted on certain days of the year due to the climate, you'll see, particularly during the closed period, that the export of phosphorus decreases quite significantly because of the restrictions. And in fact, during the open period, which is the one we should really be looking at because that's when currently applications are allowed, there's a 24% reduction in phosphorus losses under those restrictions. If the phosphorus was allowed to be spread in slowly during the closed period, then the losses are far higher than in the open period, as you can see by the black line going up to 0.35 kilograms per hectare of P. So, and the red line during that closed period between mid-October and February also shows that even under NAP regulations, there are still significant losses up to about 0.25 kilograms per hectare of P. And importantly, that's from a field, that's at the field scale. So that's what's been predicted by the model to be coming off the field and into the water courses. And obviously what happens downstream in the water courses is not simulated, but that's also of interest to the regulators. And I'll pass it back to Donnacha there.
Okay, thank you, Russell. So I think just to reiterate what Russell said there, you know, the nitrates action program or nutrients action program in Northern Ireland is having an impact in terms of improving losses of phosphorus to waters, particularly in the open period, you're seeing improvements. However, we are still seeing significant losses, and because of that, I think we need to consider and look at what other options are available. So we do need to look at additional mitigation measures to address the issues around trying to reduce slurry loss even further in Northern Ireland. And there's a number of different ways we can look at this. Firstly, the key thing we need to consider here is right time, right place. And that's something that farmers are already trying to do. But to achieve that properly, I think we need to look at access to higher resolution soil and weather data for farmers. We also need to consider the peat content of our slurry and try to reduce the peat content of our slurry as much as possible and within the confines of animal health. But we do need to reduce the peat content of our slurries by reducing the P input to the system. We also need to reduce the application rates if possible and look at how we can use lower application rates in maybe higher risk areas. And also we need to consider the changes to the close period and whether that would have an impact. So these are sort of scenarios we looked at with this model. Okay, so firstly, right time, right place. So looking at the modeling, the model can be looked at comparing how phosphorus loss from a poorly drained soil compared to phosphorus loss from a moderately drained soil or a well-drained soil. And if you can target applications at a moderately drained soil instead of a poorly drained soil, you get 42% less P loss on any particular day. So that's quite a significant reduction. If you can target it at well-drained soils, you're going to get an 87% reduction. So just highlights the importance of targeting at those well-drained soils. Also, if we can limit the applications to times where soil moisture deficit is above 0, so it's at +5, +10, and it's particularly in the open period, we will see a further 44% reduction in SRP. So it's really important that we get this sort of information out to farmers in terms of soil moisture deficit, rainfall, high resolution data around rainfall and soil moisture deficit. One of the approaches that we're taking in Northern Ireland, and this is a graph from the EAA scheme that I mentioned some time ago, where in the upper band catchment, we provided 400 farmers with runoff risk maps, as well as soil P maps, nutrient maps for all, and also pH maps and so forth. And these runoff risk maps, just to explain them in a little more detail, and they show a couple of things. The red and yellow areas combined show those areas within this farm's landscape that are high risk for runoff. And those are the areas that a farmer needs to avoid if he or she is going out to spread slurry on any particular day. And the areas that are in red here alone are those areas that are high risk for runoff, but already have a high soil P content, so above the agronomic optimum. So you'd want a farmer to avoid spreading fertilizer or slurry in those areas to try and draw down that P content of the P content in those areas in the soil. Also in this map, it gives the farmer a lot of good information. You see all the purple lines, which are the ditches and the small streams that go through our farms, and those dots, which are the blue dots in the on the map there. Those are the points where those runoff risk areas enter into a stream and into a stream or a ditch. And those are sort of areas where you would want to target some sort of nature-based solutions, such as riparian zones, willow buffer strips, wetlands and so forth, ditch retention ditches and so forth. So there's a lot of things you could kind of target in the landscape to try and manage any runoff that's coming from those areas. So the ambition in Northern Ireland is to supply these sort of maps to the 600,000 farmers, for 600,000 fields, not farmers, obviously, and 600,000 fields across Northern Ireland. And that's going to be done through the Soil Nutrient Health Scheme, which was just announced there by the Minister. And that's a huge task for us to do that. It'll be over 4 years that we're hoping to go through that. It's a voluntary scheme, but hopefully the farmers will see the value in coming in and getting the soils tested, getting these sort of runoff risk maps and using these going in the future. Because what we have seen is, of those 400 farmers, we did a survey in terms of behavioral change, and we did this in conjunction with Leeds University, our collaborators in Leeds University, and we looked at how do this sort of information around maps that we're providing farmers help change their behavior in terms of nutrient management. And one of the things that the responses showed was that 90% of farmers were still using these runoff risk maps in terms of helping them to manage their slurry and ensuring they weren't losing any slurry to water courses. So that was a very positive result. So the other element is how do we lower the phosphorus content of our slurry? There's a lot of research done around the fact that if you have a lower P diet, you have a lower P content in your slurry. And if you think back to the earlier slides, I highlighted that there's an increase in the P content, an increase in feed concentrate use on farms in Northern Ireland. Currently, the P content of our feed is somewhere around 0.5%. And we need to get that down. We need to get it lower so that we can reduce the P content in the slurry. But what the modeling showed us was that if we can reduce the P content in the slurry, then you reduce what's lost to water. And it was very similar. If you reduce it by 10%, then you get roughly a 10% reduction in loss. Same if you reduce the P content of your slurry by 30%, you get roughly a 29% reduction in what you lose. So that's very positive. That's a mitigation measure that we could take forward if we can do that. And that's something I'll come back to later in the next few slides. Application rate is also something we need to consider carefully, because in Northern Ireland, we have one of the things we've done for February, because February is still a risky month for slurry application, is we've reduced our application rate limits to 30 cubic meters per hectare. For the rest of the year, it's 50 cubic meters per hectare. But if we're applying it through the modeling, we can see that if you're applying at 50 cubic meters per hectare, you're losing roughly 0.7 kilograms per hectare per year on it from any application in a particular day. If you can reduce your application rate to 30 cubic meters per hectare, you get a 53% reduction, which is quite a significant reduction in loss. And if you can reduce your application rate even further down to 10 cubic meters per hectare, then your losses are reduced down by 80%. So, the key thing here is if we can use application rates to our and use those differentiated application rates depending on where we're spreading slurry in the landscape. If we're spreading slurry in a high risk area, reduce the application rate so that we have a lower risk of losses. So I'm going to bring up this graph already. Russell has presented this graph, and I suppose we need to consider the issues around extending the close period, but also shortening the close period, which is also something that can be considered. If we and we did this, we looked at this using the model, and we looked at extending the close period. So currently the close period goes from the 15th of October to the 31st of January, and that means if we, during the open period, which is the periods where farmers are allowed to spread slurry, if we would be getting 0.065 kilograms per hectare loss. If we extend the close period to 1st of October to 29th of February, we would get a 14% decrease in the amount of slurry we're losing during the open period. Now, I think this has to be put into context because the model would suggest we're getting 14% reduction in losses if we extend the close period. However, it does not take into account the fact that there's going to be more storage, there's going to be more slurry being stored during that period, and that means there's going to be an increase in slurry application during the open period, and that brings with it its own risks. On the other side, we can look at shortening the close period. Could we have less storage and have options for spreading slurry during January? In this case, we looked at specifically at January and going from 15th of October to the 31st of December. And what we found here was that there was a 4.5% increase in the amount of P that was lost. Now, again, that needs to be taken into context of that. If you think back to one of my earlier graphs, only 3% of days were available for slurry spreading in January. So the key thing in achieving that, keeping slurry losses in January to a minimum and keeping it down to only 5% increase, will be targeting those days that are suitable for slurry spreading. And that's the big challenge here, is that identifying those days in January that will be suitable for slurry spreading based on so much deficit and based on rainfall. Okay, so gone through a number of different mitigation measures there, but the key question for us in Northern Ireland going forward is that we do have a significant surplus of slurry within our system, and the surplus of phosphorus in particular within the food system. So even if we implement those mitigation measures that I've just worked through there, we still have a significant amount of slurry being applied in our soils in an inherently risky environment. So how can we address that at a national level? So to look at those scenarios, we use that SFA model, that big complex model I presented there earlier. We used that model to look at different scenarios. And one of the scenarios we looked at was, well, if we want to achieve a target of 35 micrograms per liter, what changes would have to occur in the system. Now, just to be clear here again, we chose 35 micrograms per liter as a generic target because the model wasn't able to deal with kind of the variable targets that we have in Northern Ireland. So we just chose one, and it's fairly representative. It's fairly average for if you average across all of the river basins in Northern Ireland. So it's not exactly correct, but it's a good estimation of where we need to be. Now, to achieve that target of 35 micrograms per liter, we would need to get to a surplus of roughly 1.5 kilograms of P surplus in Northern Ireland. And how would we get there? Well, again, these are only one scenario, okay, one example of a scenario of how we could possibly get there. There's 3 steps that could be taken. We could reduce the fertilizer import and reduce the use of P by 75%. We could reduce the animal feed P concentrate down to 0.35%, and we could export about 20% of our manure P out of the system. Now, just to kind of consider those 3 in a little bit more detail, 75% reduction in fertilizer use looks to be a big reduction, and it is a big reduction. But I think if you put it into context that 42% of our soils already have too much already have too much P going into them, and are already above the agronomic optimum, then in those soils we don't need to be using fertilizer, and some farmers are still using fertilizer in those soils. Also, we have...
Sorry to interrupt. We've about 1 minute left here, just to allow for time for questions afterwards.
Yeah, no problem. I'm coming to the end now. Just one more slide after this. And then the second thing is the animal feed concentrate. Now, this is an option in reducing the animal, and the industry has made efforts to reduce the peat content of the feed. However, if we try to get it down to 0.35, there is an economic cost there in terms of the cost of feed to farmers. So that needs to be factored in. And also, this is where we're really focusing our efforts at the moment, is export, processing our manures, valorizing our manures, through AD, through extraction of the nutrients, through production of energy, and getting that energy into the gases, into the system. So that's where we're really making our efforts at the moment, is around that nutrient processing. So listen, all those scenarios there that's one scenario, but there's other scenarios that you can look at. There's a report there I've referenced on the AFBI website that goes through the whole of the Refocus project and the scenarios that we did in terms of sustainable phosphorus management in Northern Ireland. So finally, just take-home messages. So this is my last slide. The reality is, in Northern Ireland, slurry spreading is an inherently risky practice, and even under best management practices, we are still losing phosphorus loss to water. The NAP regulations, and there's no doubt the NAP regulations are making a difference, but it is very much dependent on right time, right place. And to do that, farmers need access to high resolution data and soil moisture data. Because even on the best practices, we only need to lose 5% of our P to water, and it's still causing a problem with water quality. And so it's a very small amount that we're actually losing. And finally, which I've just highlighted here, we have more P in the system than is required for agronomic purposes. So we need to address that issue. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Donnacha and Russell. Excellent presentation, and I know you talked us through some of those graphs very, very well, because I know it's sometimes hard to get your head around some of these things, especially early on a Friday morning. You presented there a fairly stark reality there, based on the modelling that you've done in relation to that surplus of phosphorus, and you talked about a 75% reduction in fertilizer P required to bring it down. Do you think that that's going to be sustainable in terms of annual production, or you're saying that this figure is sufficient for food production in Northern Ireland?
No, within this presentation, no, we're not saying that figure is sufficient, because there's further research to do around how long on what particular farm systems can we reduce fertilizer use and remain sustainable. Because I think in some farm systems, we're finding in some of our lower intensity farming systems, farmers are using too much fertilizer, and that they could potentially be productive at index -2 or even at index 1 at some stage in our particular soils. And so it's about trying to identify the farms in Northern Ireland that can reduce their fertilizer input. But the reality is we have a huge amount of nutrients available within our slurry that's not been utilized. And the priority should be utilizing that slurry to keep our production, optimizing our production and maximizing what we're getting out of the system. And also we have a huge amount of our soils that are above the agronomic optimum that don't need any fertilizer. So reducing P fertilizer is a viable option, but it needs to be done correctly and based on soil testing.
I imagine there'll be a fairly significant advisory effort needed there to support that change.
Yeah, that's 100%. And one of the things, that soil nutrient health scheme that I mentioned earlier, the £35 million scheme that the government have just announced. AFBI is leading the delivery of that scheme in terms of the soil analysis and the development of runoff risk maps. But beside that, we have our colleagues in CAFRI, who are advisory services in Northern Ireland, and they're doing a big training program around nutrient management and how those maps need to be used and how they need to improve. So 100% that's part of that overall package that the government is trying to provide to farmers.
We have a huge number of people joining us here today, so I think we'll skip straight to the questions, including probably one of the godfathers of this science in Ireland, Dr. Owen Carton is joining us today, and I see Phil Jordan has a question in as well. So welcome to both Phil and Owen. Pat, do you want to kick off the questions?
Yeah, I suppose one of the themes that's coming through in a number of questions is the consideration of nitrogen and particularly in relation to the risk profile you were using, do you not need to add the nitrogen element to it, or is nitrogen not a particular problem in terms of nitrate loss to water?
Okay, it's a fair question. Nitrate isn't a big issue in our fresh waters. We don't have a big, and in groundwater as well, we don't have a significant issue with nitrates. And so but it is an issue for us in terms of our coastal water bodies. So we do need to, the model isn't set up to do that, but we do need to consider that in terms of how we manage our slurry. And Russell is working on a project at the moment looking at what models can we use, what other models are out there in terms of modeling all nutrients and not just phosphorus. So it's an answer, but it's not an issue for us in freshwater. Groundwater really it isn't an issue. It's really just the coastal areas that we're seeing the issues around nitrates.
A question, or there was a comment that with the price of fertilizer in the next year, that you might resolve some of the fertilizer issues. There might be an opportune time to get that messaging out that a lot of farmers don't need to spend on a very expensive product for next year. So I think take that as a comment more than a question.
It's a good point.
But it does underline the point, Pat, about the economic aspect of this. This is an economic loss to the system, really, isn't it? And I just wonder, is that something that you've looked at, actually putting a cost on this?
Yeah, well, we are working with our economic colleagues and our colleagues Erin Sherry and are developing up a farm optimization model to look at, if we reduce soil P to different levels, what is the economic cost to agriculture, and also if we reduce the feed P inputs and the fertilizer inputs, how does that change the economics of farms? That's been done through Refocus project. Has also been applied in the catchment care project, and we'll be applying it for the nitrates action program. Yes, so 100%. The economics of this is really, really important, and there has been some work done on it on a kind of macro scale. I'm using the FAPRI model, which is what we have in Northern Ireland. But now we're looking at kind of scaling that down to farm scale also.
The question there from Jenny Deacon in relation to the focus seems to be very much on source control. Are there any moves in Northern Ireland to look at measures for other parts of the nutrient transport continuum and, for example, pathway interception?
Yeah. Listen, there's always thinkings around that, and there is obviously always thinkings around. And Russell is nature-based solutions is one of the things that Russell is particularly interested in around targeting of measures. And we riparian zones, the ESF scheme that we the environmental farming scheme that we have, it's encouraging farmers to take up riparian zones. And we do look at different options. For example, willow buffer strips is something that we have kind of invested heavily in and kind of showing the effectiveness of those. So it is something that needs to be taken in as the overall toolbox for dealing with this issue. But ultimately, I think that we have to have some sort of source control. There has to be some sort of source control, because if not, then those pathway controls just become saturated with P, and you maybe just shifting the problem further down the chain. So I think there has to be a combined approach. It's not our main focus, but it is an important focus for us as well.
Okay, we get a lot of questions on the possibilities for, I suppose, removing elements of manure out of the system and turning it into other products.
Yeah.
Given the level of excess that you're talking about, is that in any way a feasible opportunity?
Yes, it is, and it's something that has been very carefully considered in Northern Ireland. In fact, there was a report just from an expert industry group, including people from AFBI, just went to the minister, advising on how we can deal with that surplus and how we can get maximum value out of that manure. My colleague Chris Johnson, who heads up our agri and technology section, is doing a lot of work around valorization of manure. How can we get as much energy out of that manure as possible and get that onto the grid? And secondly, how can we get fertilizer products out of it in terms of extracting the nitrogen and phosphorus? One of the key issues that we're trying to address is, what scale do you do that at? Do you do it at a farm scale? Is it economically viable to do it at farm scale? Maybe on some big farms, or do we need centralized approach to dealing with that? And if you look at the way Northern Ireland has dealt with the poultry litter issue, there's been the development of one big centralized processing sorry, the name eludes me at the moment, but it's one big system where they're extracting the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and getting as much out of that poultry litter as possible. And so we're looking at it. I would suggest it'd be worth having Chris Johnson on to give a bit more of a talk in relation to what we're doing and approach we're looking at, because there's lots of exciting work that's going on there.
A question there, is there any active incentive to farmers to manage riparian zones or other natural methods to try and protect the water courses? Is there anything within your schemes or within your systems to do that?
Yeah, so the environmental farming scheme, which farmers would be funded to take on riparian zones, and there would be the uptake isn't as good as we would like. There is good uptake, but yeah, so we're not seeing the uptake that you would hope. But it is something that's being encouraged, and it's something that we are in AFBI. We're monitoring. Rachel Cassidy is evaluating the effectiveness of that scheme in terms of how those riparian zones are improving management. The challenge is getting farmers to take more than a 2 meter buffer strip, take a 5 meter buffer strip, or even take a 10 meter buffer strip is extremely challenging, and for the right reasons. It's taking land out of production, but getting them to take up buffer strips that are wide enough to make a real difference is difficult. However, there is good uptake of the 2 meter buffer strips, and that's keeping cattle out of streams, which is a very positive thing. And all the research has been done on that, and providing feeders off away from streams, or drinking water troughs away from streams, has been a key focus.
There's a question here, I suppose, more focused at Russell.
Yeah.
Where is the greatest uncertainty in the modelling prediction, and how much validation is being undertaken to check that the SRP predictions are correct?
Well, to answer that question, the model has been developed primarily using data sets from the USA, and there's 5 published studies in the USA that have validated the results using plot scale experiments. So similar to the experiments of Johnstown, Castle Moor Park, and in AFBI Hillsborough. So from those you've got a time series of runoff data during events, which would give you phosphorus concentration and flow, and then that's compared with what the model predicts. The model actually takes the flow as well; it doesn't predict flow itself. So the model will predict phosphorus concentration, and that's compared against the observed concentration, and you can split that into 2 periods. So you could look at the calibration period and the validation period, but most of the parameters in the model are actually quasi-physically based, like soil properties, for example, so they're not calibrated as such. There's not a lot of calibration with surface. It primarily uses actual real-field data. But those papers of it, the farming system is obviously slightly different, but that's the best validation we have will be from that study, and also a study by Sharon, what's the surname?
Sharon O'Rourke.
Yes, also using the data to run the model at Hillsborough in Northern Ireland. She's also published a paper showing the results are quite acceptable in terms of validation.
There's a couple of questions around the use of the data that has been generated by the soil test survey that's been taken on board. One relates to the nuancing of P advice in dry versus wet soils, and in particular maybe versus peat soils. Is there any degree of nuancing? And then there's another question looking at the pH. Is there significant focus on pH as a result of that soil analysis?
Yeah, I actually don't understand the first question.
First, I suppose that we down south we have a different regulatory set of levels of nutrient that you can use on peat soils because of the inherently leaky nature of the soils from a peat perspective. So it was just asking, is that in place in the north?
I can't, Johnson lose me at this moment in time, is the regulations around the peat soils. We are definitely trying to refine our P advice on a range of different soils, and one of those would be our basaltic soils. I can't quite remember the advice on the peat soils, but I'll look into it and I'll come back to you on that.
No, I can't help either. I know that some of the host classes we looked at have got humic topsoils, so the upper soil layers will be quite sensitive to any applications, but they don't cover a particularly large area of the farmed area, do the catchment?
No.
Okay.
No, none do the Donnacha.
In terms of pH, yes, that's a big one for us, and that is through the soil nutrient health scheme that's being rolled out. pH will be something that we're trying to address, and for all farmers, we'll be getting advice around and what they need to do around pH.
Yeah, and I suppose it does release an extra amount of P if you resolve the pH, which may add to the problem a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know whether there's a question or a comment, but there's a question there in relation to the kind of the fundamental nature of the high input systems in the north versus the more common systems in the south, and is that something that could be looked at, or is that above the pay grade at the moment?
So I suppose to clarify, what you're asking is why we have a high input system compared to the south, or is this the high input
or is
system?
there a merit in considering a change?
Well, listen, that's a very complex question, and we all know that's a difficult one. There's environmental concerns to be taken into account around the sort of system that we have. However, there's also the economic and the social concerns that we have in relation to the agriculture is an integral part of our rural environment. So we have jobs and so forth to consider. I do think there's a number of things that we are considering carefully. Is that firstly, that we haven't really provided farmers with the technology to manage that system as well as they can at this point. And I mentioned their high resolution data in relation to soil and water. We need to give that to them. So before we make that decision, is the agriculture too intensive? And we need to provide them with that technology and that information. Secondly, I think we need to look at, we all know there's a huge variation in the relationship between the intensity of agriculture and its impact on the environment. We need to understand that relationship better in terms of where we can increase intensity and where we may have to prioritize other ecosystem services in the future. So it's a very complex issue, and it is being discussed, as same as it is down south. It is being discussed, but it's not something that is it's something that's high up on the agenda to be addressed. Yes.
Yeah, and I suppose a final comment, you talk about exports, and there's just a comment in there that if exports really means export to the south, because that's the only reasonable, so something to be really careful about. That 20% of Northern Ireland phosphorus being exported here would require careful assistance. I think it's a
sure, and that needs careful cross-border consideration. And if you're looking to future funding, Peace Plus is one of the things that's one of the big cornerstones of Peace Plus is an operational framework for cross-border nutrient management, because you don't want that situation us sending. But we're also, in fairness, we're also looking at sending it across to when you say export, depends on the product that you ultimately come up with from your manure. It could be exported across the UK as well, because they have a high requirement for phosphorus in a lot of the UK.
Okay, we must leave it there, I'm afraid. We're right up on our time, a little bit over, but I think it was worth the few extra minutes. Donnacha, thank you so much. And Russell, thanks for your excellent contribution today. And Pat, thanks for helping with the questions. So just to remind everybody that today's session has been recorded and will be available on the Teagasc YouTube channel. Next week, we're going to be joined by Dr. Bob Rees from SRUC in Scotland, who will be talking about the implications of net zero for the UK agriculture. So net zero carbon, I imagine that means. So Bob has a very, very interesting perspective and on how, I know from speaking to Bob before, is really interesting insights into how the UK are heading towards net zero carbon. So I just want to say thanks to Vaughan Maher, who's working in the background to support the technical side today, and also Andy Boland, who's the series producer. So we'll see you next Friday at 9:30. Have a good weekend and stay safe. Thanks very much. You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.